All right, guys, welcome back for Section 11. All right, today we are starting our discussion on jails, prisons, corrections, and at the end we're going to have our last section is going to be our section on juvenile justice. So that's what you got to look forward to. But today we're talking about prisons. So here's our funny internet picture of the day. Come on, that's a little funny. No, maybe? All right. So, early prisons in the United States were really not good. Okay, they would obviously and completely be a violation of the 8th Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishment if we tried to do the same things today that we did way back when. Okay, so first off, in prisons, it wasn't just people who had committed crimes. Okay. Included in prisons, all just kind of lumped together into this big giant area that constituted prisons, were not just criminals, but also the mentally ill, right? Which, you know, if people have schizophrenia, have some kind of mental illness, instead of going to a hospital back then, they would just go to the prison. Poor people. If you couldn't pay your debts in early America, you would be arrested and put in prisons. Okay, so you know, as someone who has a whole lot of student loans, I am really glad they don't do that today. And then orphans, right? So children with no parents, instead of being sent to orphanages, instead of being sent to foster care, instead of being sent to any of those places that we use in the modern day, a lot of times they would just get shoved in with the prisons. It was just kind of a giant housing area for all the people under the kind of the control of the state, the government, right? And they just shoved everybody in together. These early prisons were incredibly crowded. And by crowded, I mean way worse than they are today, to the point where there are reports in some areas of prisons being so crowded that the prisoners had to take turns lying down, because if they didn't have enough room for everybody to lie down on the floor. So like half the people had to be standing and clustered in one corner while the other people lied down and got some sleep. So I mean, these are really crowded. But if you were rich, you could get a lot better accommodations. Okay, you could pay for privileges. You could get basically anything you wanted as long as you brought in enough money to pay for these things. There was, this is in the United States, obviously, but it was around the same time and in a similar vein. There was a famous French criminal called the Marquis de Sade, and he did a lot of writing about some really, let's just say, interesting things back in the 18th century. But he was arrested and put in a French prison, but because he was rich, he was the Marquis de Sade, and Marquis is a title, like, you know, in England they would have like dukes or barons or whatever. Marquis is a title in France. And so he had a whole bunch of money. So he had his own private jail apartment with servants and, you know, writing implements all he wanted, and he could get this and that because he was rich. And so, you know, he couldn't leave, but he was able to afford a really nice prison stay. And it was similar things happen in the early United States where, you know, if you were rich, you could have a much better prison stay than most. If you were not rich, you had to work, right? So even within these early prisons, if you wanted any kind of money, if you wanted, you know, even to buy food, you had to work, and it could have been, you know, mostly kind of rural agrarian work, but it could have been factory work or manufacturing work or whatever. The sanitation was not good, right? And a lot of the times the restroom facilities were a bucket. If you were real lucky, it was, you know, there was like a latrine trench where you could use the restroom. The disease was rampant, and a lot of people died from violence, from disease, from just being overcrowded, from neglect, from all kinds of problems that are really disturbing. And it took a long time before anybody noticed these conditions and decided to do something about it. Okay, So late 1700s, early 1800s, there was a religious group called the Quakers. Have you guys heard of Quaker Oats? Like you can still buy them to this day. They got the blue thing with the white circle and the guy's face on it. He's wearing kind of late 17th century or late 18th century clothing. That oat brand was started by this religious group called the Quakers, and they're still around. A fairly small religious community, mostly up in the Northeast. But these guys, this religious group, looked at these early prison conditions and they said, "Wow, that is really messed up. Like that's bad. We should not be treating human beings like this." So they opened their first facility that they opened was called the Walnut Street Jail, and it was kind of designed, built, and run by this Quaker group. And this was such a success that they opened a much larger prison, essentially, that was called the Eastern State Penitentiary. Okay. Now, I'm sure you've heard this word before, penitentiary, but what is the root word there? What is where does that word come from, penitentiary? Well, this was the first one, okay? And penitentiary comes from the word penitent, as in somebody being penitent before God, admitting their sins, trying to reform, trying to be a better religious subject, right? Because the Walnut Street Jail and the Eastern State Penitentiary were both run by the Quakers, they became known as these penitentiaries, where people went to be penitent, okay? They had some very interesting rules when looked at from a 21st century eye. So first off, everything had to be done in complete silence. Prisoners were not allowed to talk at all. They weren't allowed to talk to the guards. They weren't allowed to talk to fellow prisoners. They spent the entire prison sentence in silence, okay? The better to contemplate their sins and violations of religious law and try to kind of reform themselves. They also were issued Bibles. They were required to do a certain amount of time of Bible study every day. And again, in an effort to be penitent, to figure out what they did wrong and try to reform themselves. They also this was revolutionary at the time, they got individual cells, right? So each prisoner had his own, fairly large from modern perspective, cells where they could live, eat, work. Everything they did was in that cell, okay? But the problem with this system, it was kind of too successful for its own good, right? So the states around this area that saw the success of these Quaker, the Walnut Street jails and the Eastern State Penitentiary, started sending more prisoners and more prisoners and more prisoners, and they quickly got overrun. So they were kind of a victim of their own success. An alternative system started up around the same time, which was much closer to what we think of for modern day prisons. Still not quite there, but closer to what we think of as modern day prisons. And this was called the Auburn system. Okay, this was much cheaper than the Quaker system. The Quaker system was very expensive, obviously, because they were had all this individual area and all this special treatment of prisoners. So the Auburn system was much cheaper, and it took a system of stacked cells, right? So the cells were much smaller, right? In some cases, they were like 3 foot wide by 7 foot deep by 7 foot tall. So very small cells, and they would stack them. So like, there was, a line of cells, and then on top of that, a line of cells, and then on top of that, a line of cells. And that way, they only had to have one guard that could see into a whole bunch of different cells. And that's something we still use in a lot of prisons to this day. If you go into a modern prison, you'll notice a lot of them, they have these tiers, and then there's kind of one guard station that guards all of the tiers, because you can kind of see into the cells no matter how many you stack on top of each other within reason. But they only spent time in their cells kind of at night. Like that was where they slept. During the day, they would work. They would work on a farm, they would work in a factory, they would work manufacturing something, building something, woodworking, whatever. But they would have some kind of work that they had to work in all day. Now, similar to the Quaker system, they had to remain silent. They weren't allowed to talk to guards, they weren't allowed to talk to fellow prisoners. It was all about silence, silence, silence. but it was much more about being outside, working, producing, making, and less about religion and sin and trying to figure out what was going on. And because they were working, this was much more financially self-sufficient, right? So whatever products that the prisoners made could be sold to make a profit for the prison. So these prisons didn't require any kind of outside money. The state loved them because they were essentially free, right? They made their own money, ran their own way, didn't require any taxpayer money to fund these things. The problem was, well, we'll talk about that in the next slide. But the Auburn system was also a big fan of corporal punishment. Okay, so we talked about this in an earlier section. Corporal punishment can mean, you know, whipping, stress positions, beatings, you know, any kind of, if you had any kind of infraction, you would face a very harsh physical punishment for that infraction. Okay? So, 1800s, mid 1800s, we have this really big thing in the United States. You've probably heard of it. It was called the Civil War. The Civil War, after the Civil War was passed, one of the giant legal changes that we made in this country after the Civil War was the 13th Amendment, which said slavery is essentially illegal, but if you read the text of the 13th Amendment, it says, except in cases of punishment for a crime committed. Loophole. Okay? So after the Civil War, the South, they have no more slaves. They don't have anybody to you know, run the plantations and pick cotton and run these farms and these ranches and everything. So they figured out that there's this loophole in the 13th Amendment. And they started in the Old South what's called the convict lease system. Okay? So essentially what would happen was people would get arrested, and the vast majority of these were African American because it was the South in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They would go to prison for a very short while. You know, if they got sentenced to, say, 10 years, they would only be in the actual prison for a very short time. And then some local landowner, plantation owner, farm owner, ranch owner would go to the prison and say, hey, I need this many people to work on my land. And the prison would say, okay, for an annual rate of X number of dollars, you can have this many people. And the plantation owner would buy those people, and they would go live on the plantations, usually in the old slave quarters, doing the same job that the slaves did, right? So it was a way to essentially continue that whole process of slavery long after the Civil War was over, okay? This is also where we start getting the first chain gangs, right? So if you want to try to minimize the number of people escaping, you know, take 9, 10, 15 of them, and you chain them all together into one long thing, and then they can still go up and down the fields working the way that they are legally required to work now, but they can't run away unless all of them decide to run away, and even if all of them decide to run away, they won't get very far because they're all chained together. So it was essentially a continuation of slavery with very minor changes. By the 1930s, the convict lease system has mostly gone away, but we've got, again, a very minor change. So we've got these prison farms. If you've ever seen the movie Life with Eddie Murphy and, I forget the other guy that's in it, but Life is depressing but hilarious movie because, you know, it's a comedy, but it takes place in this really kind of depressing, disturbing prison farm from the early 20th centuries, where essentially they've mixed the convict lease system and the prison system. So now the inmates are still working on plantations or farms or ranches, or sometimes even, you know, even though it's called a prison farm, it might be a manufacturing business or a factory of some kind, but it's run by the state, It is owned by the prison, and that is the prison, and the prisoners work on it. A lot of times there are no walls, there are no cells. It's just kind of a big bunkhouse where the workers or prisoners live. And then if they run away, they know they'll get shot. Like there was no physical wall. They just knew if they ran away, somebody was going to shoot them. And again, states like these because they were still self-sufficient. They would sell the food or the manufactured goods or whatever, and were able to pay for themselves. So this was a much better. This was an evolution from slavery to the convict lease system to the prison farm up to kind of what we have today. And what we have today is what we're going to talk about next time on section 11.2.